Something important to talk about is correlation of crypto. In many cases, usually this means Bitcoin, because pretty much all crypto assets, or most crypto assets, kind of follow what Bitcoin does. But the correlation with NASDAQ or the S&P and the investment theses around Bitcoin as an inflation hedge or as a store of value, and how sometimes those narratives can get flipped and sometimes they can get utilized for Bitcoin or against Bitcoin. And first, we want to look at the narrative around the store of value and inflation hedge, because what we saw is when we actually had inflation, we saw inflation from the end of 2022 through 2023, and the price of Bitcoin early on went down, and people said, see, there's inflation and Bitcoin isn't going up. My contention there, and of course I'm being somewhat of a Bitcoin apologist, but my contention there is Bitcoin had such a huge run up in price that was driven by retail users that didn't really know the investment thesis. They just wanted to get in on something that was going up. They just had FOMO and it moved the price up. The same way the prices of Tesla and Amazon and Google and Zoom and Peloton went up when everyone was, during COVID, when everyone was sitting around on their Pelotons and on Zoom calls all the time. And so the price of Bitcoin went up, but it wasn't because of the store of value inflation hedge narrative. It was because people had money and they didn't really have anything else to do, and they were just trying to invest it or trying to really speculate and make money, and it drove the price up. And, a bunch of institutions jumped in and started buying Bitcoin. We saw this run up. And so then when the price came down, as inflation went up, what we have to remember is two things. One, the price was probably overly inflated. It wasn't where it should have been. So if we look at the price from just pre-COVID until very recently and juxtapose that with inflation, it did exactly what it was supposed to do, right? The fact that you had this huge run up and run down in the middle, and of course we had issues like FTX and Celsius and Voyager and Terra Luna and Three Arrows Capital and all those other bad things that happened, including regulation that got in the way. You had a pullback in all crypto prices, and now we kind of see Bitcoin moving up again. When we do have inflation, even though the rate of inflation might be coming down, we still have Bitcoin moving up as a potential store of value. And then you have the idea of this correlation with NASDAQ. So real quick, let me go back to the inflation part. When we do have inflation, it means that people are having to spend more money on things that they buy every day. We also have not seen wages necessarily go up. So people have less money at the end of every month to go invest. And of course, Bitcoin is very much based on supply and demand. So if people don't have the dollars to invest in Bitcoin, to put into Bitcoin, then the price isn't going to go up. And that is a relatively short-term thing. Eventually, you would think that the levels of inflation will level off with wage growth and such. And if we see more inflation or we see wage growth, whatever, you might see some of that money transferring back into Bitcoin. So in a short period of time, because people don't have as much money at the end of every month to invest, they don't invest in Bitcoin, just like they don't invest in anything else. They invest in buying food for their family and gas for their car and paying their electric bills that might be going up in price. The other part is the correlation with NASDAQ and S&P. We saw a huge correlation with NASDAQ and S&P during COVID because, again, people were home, they were getting free money from the government, they were still probably earning their salaries without actually having to go to work. So they weren't having to pay for as much gas, they weren't having to pay for as many things, they weren't going on vacation. And what were they doing? They were investing. They were doing it on Robinhood with options, they were doing it in crypto. And so we saw everything kind of moving together because people were just investing, speculating, trying to make money. Kind of more recent days, we have seen a break of that correlation between NASDAQ and Bitcoin because people, I think, have looked at some of the micro factors of Bitcoin that we've talked about, which are things like a possible ETF, some of the macro factors like inflation, like a need for an inflation hedge and a store of value, or as Larry Fink put it, a flight to quality or a flight to something that is scarce, like gold or Bitcoin. We're seeing that with the wars going on in the world, with inflation, with political upheaval, those kinds of things. People are going to assets like gold, and the younger people are going to assets like Bitcoin. And that doesn't necessarily correlate with what is happening in the NASDAQ and S&P because those are based on earning. Those are based on real earnings of companies. And if those companies aren't earning as much because people aren't spending money to buy things that those companies sell, then the values of those stocks won't go up. So sometimes we do see more of a correlation with NASDAQ, S&P, and just because you have a short-term correlation doesn't mean over the long term you will have it. What we've seen over the long term is there isn't very much correlation between Bitcoin and the S&P and NASDAQ. In the short term there is, and those are usually based on some sort of macro or micro factors within that time period, like COVID and like money printing and sending people checks for doing nothing but staying home. They're correlated with those types of actions, but over the long term, the investment theses are that they will not be correlated. Over the long term, we will likely not see as much correlation between Bitcoin, ETH, Solana, and such, because they will be based on their own merits. For right now, what we see is this wholesale, either people want to invest in crypto or they don't, and therefore the entire crypto markets move together. Eventually, people are going to choose to invest in Bitcoin because they want to store value, or ETH because they like the direction the network's going, or Solana because they like the building that's going on, or something like that. But right now, occasionally we see correlation and occasionally we don't. Occasionally we see the investment theses hold, sometimes we don't. If we don't, sometimes it's in a short period of time, and that's when we have to evaluate, have we broken with the investment thesis because of whatever's happening? Is the market telling us, are the numbers telling us that we've broken with the investment thesis, or is there something else going on? Are we right along with the investment thesis, but there's something going on in the macro or micro that is causing this correlation or causing Bitcoin to go down even when inflation is up?